The queen. Arguably the strongest piece in game of chess. Why is the queen so strong? Because the queen can move in any direction, the full length of the board. The queen, mind you, is not the most important piece in a game of chess. It's just a piece. There is only one important piece that we've yet to introduce. The queen can, however, move along files from beginning to end, along diagonals from beginning to end, and the same with ranks. And we got one more diagonal here. So from where this queen is standing, it can capture any one of these pieces with one turn. The strength in the queen is the ability to capture, or I should say, the ability to attack multiple pieces at once. The queen's starting position, of course, is always D8. For the dark colored queen, she stands on a dark colored square, and the light colored queen would stand on D1, which is a light colored square. So when we set up the board, the pieces that are on the board are in their proper starting places. All white pawns should be on the second rank, and of course the queen should be on D8, dark colored square. Now, at the start of this game, the queen is attacking one of the pieces. The object of this particular game is to get any one of these pawns to the back rank of the board. The queen has to stop each and every one of these pawns. If one of the pawns gets to the back rank without being captured, white wins the game. If the queen wipes out every last pawn, then the queen wins the game. Each one of these pawns is worth 1 point. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. The queen is worth 9 points. That point system is an expression of the piece's strength or capability. So if the queen is 9 and the pawns are 8, logically the queen should win the game. Now, as I said before, the queen is already attacking one of the pawn on D2. Because pawns capture along diagonals, each pawn is attacking squares that are diagonal from it. So we could take this pawn that's being attacked and put it in a square that's being attacked by its own pawns. This represents the beginning of what we call a pawn chain. If the queen were to capture this link in the chain, one of these two pawns can in turn capture. And if the queen's gone, then of course every piece for black is gone, which means the black loses the game. So it would not be wise to capture this piece. It would, however, be wise to make a move that attacks elsewhere. Let's take a look, see if we come over to the E file. Now we're attacking the pawn on E2. That pawn can move 2 squares forward. Now we have 3 links in the chain. And of course, if the pawn were to be captured by the queen, then this pawn would take back, and again, the game is over. So it would not be wise for the queen to attack the pawn on E2. So instead, what do? We use the fact that the queen travels in so many different directions, which means that at the end of any one of those given directions should be a pawn. So we are going to attack multiple pawns. If we slide on down here to D5, we are now attacking the pawn on A2, the pawn on D3, and the pawn on G2. Now it's a given we're not going to touch this pawn on D3 because these 2 pawns are links in the chain that will take back in turn. So we are, however, attacking the pawn on A2 and G2, and neither of which are being protected. So if white takes 1 turn, white can't possibly protect both pieces. Move the pawn on A2, and black will capture the pawn on G2. Move the pawn on G2, and black will capture the pawn on A2. So that is the strength of the queen, because the queen is always attacking multiple pieces if used correctly. And of course, we are going to explore using the queen correctly. The pawn on b2 is now being attacked. If we get that pawn out of the way, logically we should go 2 squares because that gets us closer to our destination. We want to get to the 8th rank of the board. But upon moving this pawn, we exposed the pawn on c2 to the queen. So feel free to capture that piece. Now, from this position, the queen is attacking the pawn on d3 and the pawn on e2. If we move the pawn on e2 out of the way, we're no longer protecting the pawn on d3 because there was 2 connected pawns, links in the chain, and we have exposed the pawn on f2. So white has to make a decision what to do. All right, maybe he will go for trying to get this pawn because it's close. The pawns on the 4th rank are the closest to the desired destination. So we'll take a step up with the pawn on the g5 up to g5, and the queen is going to capture. Now there should be what's called a tempo or a rhythm. The queen should always be either attacking or capturing. Attacking or capturing. Now with this one move to e2, we did both. We captured the piece and we're attacking the pawn on d3 and the pawn on f2. White has only one turn, which means that white cannot possibly save both of these pieces. So let's say white moves the pawn on the f file, connecting these 2 pawns and making this one safe. This one, however, is not safe, and we also revealed the pawn on h1. So what are we going to do? I think it would be wisest to capture the pawn on d3. Why the pawn on d3? Because the pawns right now that present the greatest threat of winning the game are the f4 pawn, the g5 pawn, and the b4 pawn. All of which have one thing in common. They all reside on green squares and will all have to, on the next turn, step into a square that the queen is attacking. So, of course, the only wise move for white would be to move the pawn over here on h2. Will we move it here? No, because that will result in losing it. So, we'll move it 2 squares forward because it's the first time we move that pawn, so we have the option to move 2 squares on the first move. Now, what we have to do now is we have to put the queen in a position where she is attacking more than one piece, which means we have to allow for any move that white makes. If white moves this pawn, this pawn, this pawn, or this pawn, we will still be in a position where we can capture a piece. So, for example, if we move here, we are now attacking the pawn on f4 and the pawn on h4, which means no matter what white chooses to do, we will have a piece that we can capture. So, with our move, we attacked. Now white will take a move, and black will capture. And again, we did that in a way where we are attacking more than one piece. So whatever white does, we get to capture again. Now, I think the best move for white would be here, because of course, pawns on the 5th rank are closer to the destination. If we move this piece, then we are promised to lose this guy, because it's more of a threat, being on the 5th rank, than a pawn on the 4th rank. So, the wise move again would be to move the pawn to g6. And again, we attacked with the last move, so we want to capture. So we're going to come all the way down here, d4, and capture the pawn. Now, at the start of this, I pointed out that the pawn needs to get back here without being captured. So if he goes here, we need to make sure that we're attacking both this square and this square. So how do we do that? Always attack from behind. If the pawn gets moved, we take. If the pawn doesn't get moved, we still take. So let's say the pawn were to go here. We'll take it. The wise move, of course, would be to go to h6 to protect it. That's fine. We'll just get a little closer. That way we're attacking 1, 2, 3, 4 squares All of those squares have one thing in common. One of these pawns has to step into one of them. So if white moves here, we take. There's only one more pawn left, only one more move to be made.